Welcome to Journey of an Aesthete podcast. This is your host, MitchHampton, and I'm sitting here in my usual location. There was a question of where I was going to do the show today because of quite inclement weather, storms, snow, ice, all the usual environmental elements that have been affecting all of us. And so, well, thank you. That's Laurie, our producer, reminding me that it sounds good, and that's important. The picture's clear. But there was a question. From time to time, I may do one of our episodes from another location, namely my girlfriend Joe's home. And luckily, I didn't have to bring all my books over there. I can stay here for the time being, although I'm going to see her shortly. This is part of course, of a series on Romanticism and Isaiah Berlin, and there's a lot of unusual things about this episode we're doing right now. One of them is that I'm going to be talking not only about Romanticism, as you know, even if I don't mention Romanticism, or if I don't mention Romantic or anti-romantic thinkers. It's always in the mix, as they say today. It's always, it's hovering. It's always present. If only because it's good to remind ourselves. I'm reminding myself out loud in the course of this series. I think this is episode 7, I think. If I've done that many, is something. It's always good to remind ourselves that the essential project, to the degree which anything humans do can be called a project. It's kind of a, I don't know, I hope that doesn't sound too anodyne or too wonky. The degree to which Romanticism is a project, I've suggested during this whole series, and I'll continue to maintain, hopefully not dogmatically or excessively, that when it comes to if Romanticism can be said to have core principles, that is something that sort of lasts more than a week or a month or even a century, those principles or those ideas are always with us. To a large degree, as I've said, Romanticism inaugurates in intellectual history. It inaugurates a turn towards subjectivism, the subjective. By which I mean, of course, I get up in the morning, I have a dream. I have many dreams every night, nightmares, whatever you want to call them. I have an experience. You get up, the sun. I see the sun. I'm a being who, basically, I'm a being that is consciousness, is conscious, sometimes conscientious, but not always. Alas and alack. But I possess something that we call being and consciousness, and that is largely what we call an internal matter. And again, everything that comprises this internality, this internal state of mind that have my glasses on, I'm speaking to you now. All the furniture of it, to quote William James, the furniture of the world, all the furniture of it is utterly borrowed and handed down from so many other folks going back 1,000 years or so, right? So it isn't that the furniture of my interior life isn't influenced, by other things, but it is my own, and it is, so far rather private, and it's also not really fully translatable to any other person, and never really will be, partly because of the arrangement of our bodies, that we have boundaries, and there's not, there's a physical location in which we kind of stop and some other things begin, like this piano is here and not. I'm talking in a very very basic, obvious level. So what I'm saying is that, Romanticism is sort of really asking the question, what do we do with that fact? It doesn't necessarily always give answers. It's saying we have internal experiences, we have interior experiences. Those matter, they have value. We might want to go further and say they impart on us dignity. And they're individualized. That is, it's not just or only membership in a people or a folk or a group or a race or even a species. It's Laurie Strickland or Joanne Woods or David Jones or Rachel Stewart or whoever, people. And that we begin and we end. I went on and on about this, just kind of to set the stage for the fact that we're going to be reading today, doing close reading of some rather intricate texts. And we're taking a break from another kind of text. So last time we met, we were doing a lot, starting to go deep into Herder and Hamann. One was the teacher, one was the pupil, great German romantics. And, I said, I'm going to put a pause on that. We're going to get back to Herman. We'll even get back to Kant. We're going to return to some of those Europeans of the 1740s, 1750s, those interesting years, right? Underrepresented years, when human beings today tend to get old-timey, to use a phrase I don't particularly like that the kids like to use, old-timey, we tend to end up in 1880 for some reason, right? It's always the same years that we go back to. But, there's also this 17th century, 16th century, 15th century, there's John Milton, and there's Galileo and Copernicus. There's all these things that happen. Those matter too. What I'm saying is that we're going to take a break, pause on the early romantics, German, and go towards a period of time that is at one at the same time an obsession of our culture. It's an object of great obsession, interest, but it's also an object of probably the greatest, I'm going to say something really bold, the greatest of misunderstanding and incomprehension. And I'm talking about like 1945 to, 75, those years. And I'm in the context of this episode, and since Isaiah Berlin is a creature of those years, it's really important, right? I'm going to kind of look at them with a degree of, I want to say respect, and we're going to deal with Samuel Moyn's text. Now, Samuel Moyn is a contemporary giant of political philosophy, one of the big names. And he's written on Berlin. Many people have written on Berlin, of course, and we're going to engage with him. He's a Yale Law University professor, and as his book says, Liberalism Against Itself, the Cold War Intellectuals and the Making of Our Time. So we're going to go back and we're going to go into 1950s, 1960s, the era of Hannah Arendt and Isaiah Berlin, both, and some other folks like Judith Sklar. And we're going to discuss in this episode, what about political liberalism? What about political order? What liberalism really is, because there is a really that it is. In other words, it's like a definable thing. And it is a thing, that is often, considered bad or out of date, or it's considered negatively. Even, by the way, by people that understand it. So it isn't so much always the case that people use liberal as a synonym for Stalinist or communist, heaven forbid, although some do. Some are really that far gone that they do that. It isn't only that, but sometimes people have the number of we liberals and understand us, but really simply just disagree with us and think we're wrong. So I'm going to read from John Rawls before we discuss Berlin, some of these other people, because Rawls, in his very book, Political Liberalism, which is I've read this book, right? It's many pages, but he kind of gives a we used to say I call a knockdown, drag out argument, like a kind of argument used to say QED, Queen's English Dictionary. You kind of don't really have a good answer to it. And this in no way tells us anything about how our economy should run. It doesn't tell us what we should think about a lot of our questions, whether to go to war or not, whether to be pacifist, whether to support the death penalty, really much of anything of those I'll agree, very important questions. But in the sake of minimalism, it gives us kind of a foundation. Now, okay, I thought something else I'm going to start. So we're going to start this is the book Political Liberalism by John Rawls. A lot of people have been forced to read this book. Or The Theory of Justice. One of these two books are required reading if you've ever been an undergraduate in poli-sci, even philosophy itself. You probably came across some of this. So let's look at it again if you have. I apologize if you didn't like it a minute before. But Rawls, in this text, kind of he lays down the gauntlet, as we say. And this is in medias res. We're going to go right in. And I never got to hear Rawls. Oh, no, wait a second. Did I? Once at Harvard, I think in 87, 88, I think I saw him lecture. And it was dim in my memory. But that was quite something. So this is in medias res. So in the middle of a paragraph, it's in a chapter. It's called Basic Elements, which are elements of a liberal. Rawls is trying to lay down. Look at this. The framework of what he perceives to be better governance, better statecraft. He presumes we have to have some nation state, which also, by the way, means we have to have some kind of boundaries or borders, some kind. I didn't say that those boundaries bounded borders cannot be ethically adjudicated or regulated. Certainly they can, although we're speaking in a moment in which they're most unethically treated, and they're so bad, in fact, that one of the many dangers of our current moment is that it would tempt people to want to do away with such things altogether. In excessive counter-reaction, I don't know, but enough about that. So Rawls is basically he's saying, well, why liberalism and not something else? Why not sort of royalism or conservatism in all of its forms currently? Why not those things? Monarchy? Why not communism? Why not Leninist democratic centralism? That's a term that people used once. Why not? Why not? Well, he mentions Berlin right here. According to Isaiah Berlin, any system of social institutions is limited in the values it can admit, so that some selection must be made from the full range of moral and political values that might be realized. Now, that's a mouthful. But it's saying, if you have an institution, you're going to be limited. Some kind of limit. In fact, that by virtue of even existing, it is normative that there be limits. Which, to put it in I want to put it in a real candid, brutal fashion, a legislative body, an institution, an organization can't demand that you listen to Green Day because that's the required music of the day and wear I don't know, painter's overalls because I say I want you to wear that, or we as a group want you to wear that. Can't do that. Can't tell you what music to listen to. Can't tell you what to wear. And certainly can't tell you what God is or how to worship your God. If you were, I could put it this way, lucky to have such an entity. I don't know. I can't tell you that. Now, this is a fundamental problem. So the very thing that I just got through saying is normative, that is ethically justifiable, that you don't want to tell people what music to listen to or what to think or how to dress in this, at least in this specific way, is the very thing that breaks so many people's hearts about our system, that makes them want to turn against it. Because they say, damn it, I hate the music my neighbor listens to, you know? I want to listen to my music. I have to listen to his music I hate. And I don't like the way that person is dressed. I think it's offensive. And God came to me in a dream and said, you know, God wants you to, I don't know, go to the First Baptist Church on the corner and spoke to me. And God told me that all other observations of worship, Methodist, Episcopal, Free Will Baptist, Quaker, Society of Friends, they're false, because a voice said to me that they're false. And my first church, I'm just using sort of inventing sort of colorful examples, but you take my point. That's a sense of limits, you know, on an institution. But it kind of breaks people's hearts, you know, in a way, because people say, well, darn it, you know, I want to do this. I want to do such and such. I have all these plans, and you tell me I can't do what I want to do. I can't enforce what seems just so demonstrably true on other people. Can't do it. But he goes on here. It's really, really interesting, I think. I think it's interesting. This is dense text, so I apologize if that's not your scene, but this is, as I said, this is one of the more politically oriented of our episodes, possibly excepting Elizabeth Anderson. I did an episode with Elizabeth Anderson and the great George Kateb, both, and those were they're similar to this episode, so we're returning some of that territory. So he says, so much for some sources of the difficulties in arriving at agreement and judgment. Sources that are compatible with those judging being fully reasonable. So he's, you know, saying, well, what is reasonable, right? In noting these burdens of judgment, we do not, of course, deny that prejudice and bias, self and group interest, blindness and willfulness play their all too familiar part in political life. But these sources of unreasonable disagreement stand in marked contrast to those compatible with everyone's being fully reasonable. And that's interesting. It goes on to say religious and philosophical doctrines, like the stuff I just mentioned, you know, the Baptist on the corner, the neighborhood Baptist. Religious and philosophical doctrines express views of the world in our life with one another, severally and collectively as a whole. Our individual and associated points of view, intellectual affinities, and affective attachments are too diverse, especially in a free society, to enable those doctrines to serve as the basis of any lasting and reasoned political agreement. So Rawls is saying you can't really do it. I mean, of course, for most of human history, we were doing just that. We were under the edict of a king or a tyrant of one kind or another, even our immediate family or the tribe or just the family that's just a nomadic tribe, you know, and what the tribe agrees, even if it agrees democratically, equally, that edict, that agreement you come to, even if it's shared, is still a rule, and you got to follow it, and you're under that aegis, you're under that authority, so some kind of authority. So Rawls isn't saying that, you know, for human history we weren't actually doing the thing he says you can't do, but I think Rawls is saying, you know, if we want to be honest with ourselves, we realize we can't and should not do it. And that's very basic to our Constitution. That's basically the First Amendment. You know, do not make legislation. Do not, you're not supposed to, write down in your constitution what religion people are supposed to practice. You're not supposed to, or you're not even supposed to write down that they're not allowed to have a religion to practice or any of it. You're not supposed to mention the thing at all. It's not in the purview of your rights and duties and responsibilities. Again, we're talking in a moment in the U.S. now where, to be very, kind of blunter than I don't like that. We have in our government. Well, it's complicated because we don't really have a full accounting of what we're experiencing. I mean, there is the question of if we have fascists having taken over the executive branch of our government, and if it's even true as I think it is, that we've actually destroyed in large part a system of government we had for a lot of the 20th century. That means going back to the 40s, actually. If we've destroyed that and replaced it with something else in the space of a year or 5 years, if that happened, then that's something we're going to have to fight, reckon with, deal with, of course. But that's the context, of course, of this very episode, and that's even if we have a much more optimistic view and say, well, it's just a crazy leader or just one party, and and many people think that they say, well, we live in a democracy with a fascist, democratically elected, quote unquote, fascist leadership, a fascist leader. It gets very complicated. I don't want to get too much into the weeds in that, but we're, I mentioned heartbreak. I make the metaphor of heartbreak, and it's interesting when I'm suggesting that heartbreak. What I'm suggesting is that one's heart could be broken in a kind of an almost unjustifiable sense, if that's possible. It could be the heartbreak of just, of other people not being just like you. And that I think that's really unspoken. I think possibly thousands, millions of people are just unconsciously heartbroken that the world won't conform to their every wish and actually doesn't know how to even deal with it. And I think the problem is actually so grave that you don't have to even be a narcissist to have this problem. Again, I'm not diagnosing anybody. I'm just saying there could be a general situation where you can't conceive that we live in a pluralistic world where we're just not going to agree on what music to listen to. And we don't know what to do with that. And that can wax and wane. And you can have societies in which people want to come in and tell you what to listen to, right? And come in, which is what we're seeing, essentially what we're seeing now in the States, in all sorts of ways, and to the point of, where we're gonna, we will shoot you, if you kill you if you stand in our way. So that's sort of where we are. I know this is very dry. Again, I think Rawls is a wonderful writer, but from time to time in aesthetics, we have to read dry writers and read people it's a style of writing, very, very, I worry that people will stop writing like this. I mean, I tell you that if texts like this stop being written, it would be, to me, as great of a loss as if people stopped doing pottery. I'm just saying, it's one of the art forms. So anyhow, let's go ahead. Goes on to say, different conceptions of the world can reasonably be elaborated from different standpoints, and diversity arises in part from our distinct perspectives. So he says diversity is just going to happen. There's nothing you can do about it, even if you wanted to. So remember the differences I mentioned. We can't handle difference very well. We can't handle very well people that aren't like ourselves. But yet people unlike ourselves are going to emerge. They're going to be our neighbors. They may even be. It might even be yourself. In other words, you could change inside your own life. Not totally, but you become a largely changed person through changed habits. And so it isn't only that your neighbor might not be like you might not be like you. And you at 20 might be radically different from you at 50 or you at 70. I'm not saying that's always necessarily good for that to occur, by the way. I'm not even necessarily saying that's inevitable in the strong sense, because we all differ. I mean, speaking for myself, I'm remarkably similar in many, many ways to who I was as a boy. Remarkably similar. Remarkably similar. More than many people, I might add. And yet, there's a two or three things in which I'm just very, very different. Different views. I've changed my sensibility in many things, actually, in the past 40 years. I've changed, certainly my lifestyle's changed. You know, my lifestyle now bears very little resemblance to what I did for close to 40 years. In a lot of the key foundational elements, it's just very different. And so that's an example of me not being, I guess, how did I phrase it? Me differing from myself, or seeing, you know, a change within my own life, you know. So that can happen within a single soul, single breast, as I've said. Not just person to person, not just societies. So he says this diversity arises, and he goes on to say it is unrealistic or worse. I like the fact he says it is unrealistic or worse. It arouses mutual suspicion and hostility to suppose that all our differences are rooted solely in ignorance and perversity. I'm going to sit with that phrase. So he's saying that that person that's not like you, it is not that they're getting it wrong, that they're not like you, and you're getting it right. Sorry. You might not get to say that. Conversely, it doesn't mean, of course, that you have to copy them and you're getting it wrong. It's profoundly important. It's necessarily neither of those cases, right? And when you assume that unconsciously, you arouse suspicion and hostility. You can create a climate. So that's what's happening now. I think social media is largely to blame because it creates kind of a mob mentality. And it creates sort of a pushing of conformity, unconscious conformity over tribes and teams. And there's a lot of that going on, which is similar to the problem I inaugurated this episode with, of like, what do you do with difference? How do you do with difference? So it's not ignorance and perversity. Neither is it rivalries for power, status, or economic gain. So it isn't only that differences mean somebody has it right and somebody's wrong. It isn't only that that's false, but it's not just a cover for just status and ambition, which is another way of saying that sometimes folks do stuff because they're sincere or because they actually want something, and they're not doing the thing just to get ahead, that they actually might believe in something. And sometimes somebody might sincerely believe in something, and that belief looks to me or other people as nihilistic meaninglessness, appears as such, while still being sincere belief. You know, and that's a difficult thing, you know. Many, many people believe many, many things that are just flat out wrong. That's just a case. And are sincere in that. They don't believe in a wrong thing just because it gets them a job to believe the wrong thing. They might be sincere. So that's the thing. The problem of sincerity, it's hard for us to think of sincerity as a problem. I mean, although Judith Sklar has written eloquently on the need for hypocrisy. I'll get to that in a second, but that's a complicated thing. Yeah, it's not just always rivalries for power, status, or economic gain. And these remarks lead to a fifth general fact stated thus, that many of our most important judgments are made under conditions where it is not to be expected that conscientious persons with full powers of reason, even after free discussion, will all arrive at the same conclusion. That's quite a radical thing Rawls is saying there, because he's saying that we can deliberate all day about something, and even after a full day's deliberation, you know, and I mean good, valuable deliberation. I mean all day. I mean like the way people debated in the 18th century. the time of our founding as a country, where people sat in a chair and you really talked in great length and with all kinds of elocution and rhetoric and went on and on. And the other day, it wasn't always the case, well, we need a country or we need a constitution or we need to break away from what we now say the UK or forms of economy. It may be that you come to no conclusion, that you can talk all day and you don't get anywhere. Or sometimes you can be like your host MitchHampton and say, isn't the beauty of the talk itself the point? The beauty of the writing, John Rawls's beauty in the way he writes sentences, isn't the beauty of the talk itself its own value? Possibly, and not necessarily any conclusion we can think of. I'm going to put that out there as a, so. All right. So there's the potential that we're not going to arrive at the same conclusion, even when we have all the right facts, right? Some conflicting reasonable judgments, and he has in parentheses here, interesting, some conflicting reasonable judgments, especially important are those belonging under people's comprehensive doctrines. See, it's comprehensive doctrines. May be true, others false, conceivably all may be false. So you could live in a society in which I don't know, the state religion, I'm trying to think of a patently, let's say you live in a society in which nobody observes laws of gravity or something, or I don't know, thinks the world's flat and just everybody's convinced of that. Well, that could be after much deliberation. You look ahead in the horizon and say, well, yeah, the Earth's flat and we're flat. We'll just sit with that, and for a time, and that could be your situation, right? So I'm using these very obvious, crude examples. So he says, conceivably all may be false, but he says these burdens of judgment are of first significance for a democratic idea of toleration. So why do we have a First Amendment? We have a First Amendment precisely because we will not necessarily come to an agreement. And even if we come to an agreement, we can never be 100% sure that we are eternally and finally correct. We can't know that. Since we can't know that, we can't have in our polity, in our government, as well as private market, we can't have a society where we act as if we do know. And we certainly can enforce or impose it on other people. And that's just basic, it's a basic aspect of what we call liberal political order, which is a thing after all. People like to trash the liberal political order, and they, it's funny. People will say, well, I like the political order under the New Deal. I like it in the 60s when, we had the Civil Rights Revolution. There was real power in that. And then things got really bad in the 80s. People like to cherry pick and say, and I'll sit here and tell you I don't like equally. So if you look at the 20th century, it's not all good. I mean, I'm no fan of Reaganomics, and I'm no fan of what the marketplace did to the communities around here with all of the immense suffering caused by businesses picking up and leaving. I'm no fan of that, and that's not. But isn't it interesting to consider, and very few people consider this, that while all that is going on, at the very same time, something like 1.5 billion people were lifted out of poverty in the 80s and 90s alone around the world. That's a fact. And that's an extraordinary fact. And it's an international point of view. It is true. It is not a U.S. point of view. And I hate to put it this way, but part of that was the efforts of, administrations. Some of the administrations were American. And over 20, 25 years, just trying to do a little something here, a little something there to improve life. I mean, Jimmy Carter, as you know, was concerned about disease, and he tried to go eliminate one disease. And I don't know that, I'm not an expert on it, after he was president, and that involves going and doing that. But what I'm saying is that all these efforts, so it's not all bad news, and it's not all loss of industry and plant closings, and it's not all even inequality. And I say we have great inequality, but we also have such an enormous progress in elimination of absolute poverty, which is a good thing. And so I'm of the feeling that we can just extend that franchise if we can, and that would be a good idea. But that gets us too far afield. So I want to read a little. I just wanted to read from Rawls because that's the context, you know, of any discussion of liberal democracy. When we come to Samuel Moyne, now Samuel Moyne, again, as I said, he's a brilliant, brilliant, brilliant thinker. And I don't just throw that word out there. I've read him, and he's in this text, for example, he's read all the same letters I've read. That is, all these Berlin letters, and he quotes, you know, this is what Berlin wrote to Mary McCarthy, or I don't know who, Jacob Tallman, you know, so he's very well read. He knows his stuff. But he basically, this book is an attack on what he admits are the people he hates, as he says. Not hates, but he writes about, let's see here. He doesn't like Cold War liberals. And he thinks they ruined our country. It's very interesting. In that sense, he's rather similar. Like some leftists, he's rather similar to the far right. You know, they reach these there's a kind of a weird sense in which they meet each other, even though they seem like enemies, but they kind of might agree that they hate everything from the past, and they hate. And so it's funny, you read his book, and there's these he has, you know, I love what they do here. There's Isaiah Berlin in the 50s, Romanticism in the Highest Life. So he likes Berlin somewhat. He's not totally. I mean, in one of his talks, he calls Berlin a bro. The bro, or the dude, you know, he's just being, I guess he's being cheeky or being of his generation. I don't know. But this book really is an attack on what he calls the Cold War liberals. And this is kind of the narrative. Now, I really reject this narrative, and I'm going to say right, I don't agree with Samuel Moyne. Part of the reason I don't is I don't think causation works in the way that he does. So when I look at this picture of Berlin, or I look at, I don't know, Karl Popper. Judith Sklar, there's Judith Sklar. I mentioned a lot of these people. I've read all these folks too. You know, I've read Sklar and Popper, The Open Society and Its Enemies, and I've read these folks, and Lionel Trilling. You know, I've even read Trilling's novel. What is it called? The middle of the plane, or I forget. How many people you know have read Lionel Trilling's novel? I don't know. In Arendt, you know, I've done things on Arendt, but you know, in his narrative, he sees these people as making this fundamental mistake that brought us where we are now. So I mentioned all those awful things that have occurred, are occurring, the inequality, all those things. Well, his basic, a crude summary of Samuel Moyne's thesis is, these Cold War liberals were too obsessed with anti-communism and the evils of the Soviet Union and China and Stalinism and defending democratic freedom that they lost their eye on the ball. They dropped the ball, and they got us to where we are now. Now, there's so many problems with that. The first problem is, of course, they were right. They were simply right about Russia and China. They were right that those regimes were awful regimes. So there's that problem. And also, it's just a sense, again, I'm going to come back to the sense of a context. All of these figures he's writing about were living through the 40s, 50s, 60s, 70s. They were living through those mid-century decades and seen up close. Not just the Shoah. Shoah is bad enough, the Holocaust, not just that, but the Stalin purges and the revelations of Khrushchev, and then all of the, reality. And the fact that many people around the world wanted to copy that system and did. Worst of all, people who threw off the yoke of their imperial, feudal, colonial countries didn't choose us as a role model to copy. No, they chose the Soviet Union to follow. Makes it even worse. It's bad enough you've got these regimes, but then you have liberation movements saying, yeah, we want to copy them. We don't want to copy. And that was a problem too. And so they're dealing, everything that these folks are writing, they're dealing with that. And I sort of feel like Moyne is not grappled enough sufficiently. It's a hard thing to say because he is brilliant, but as I said, brilliant people are wrong all the time. Their brilliance doesn't make them any less wrong. He hasn't grappled, I don't think, with the meaning of that century, the meaning of these thinkers. And if we look today and what we're dealing with today, we look at Putin now, in China now, and we look at the fact that we have in our country now admiration and attraction for those regimes today. I'm just saying, I'm tempted to say that, leave it at that and say, have a great weekend and come on. But I mean, that's kind of something to consider. And so I think there's a sense in which context is important. And, a Lionel Trilling and a Hannah Arendt and Isaiah Berlin is just going to look at things differently than someone who's 30 years old now or 28 years old and doesn't have the same relationship to the wall coming down, Berlin Wall coming down. If they were lived on in those years, if they did. And so I think I've spoken a lot about this, but I just want to go through here and look at some things. He's actually reprinted Judith Sklar's dissertations. I love this. Look at that. You get to see, look at that. Her dissertation. I love this. I mean, it would be like, and he mentions that Isaiah Berlin's first essay he wrote as a student? Guess what it was called? It was called Freedom. Isaiah Berlin's very first essay he wrote in the UK was an essay on freedom. I just have to say, I mean, you can't, wasn't perfect, but you got to love in the 20s. So, I mean, what can I tell you? I'd love to get a copy of that dissertation. Doesn't know if there's a lot of shoe leather. There's a lot of exiles, and he talks about the Jewish, the dominance of Jewish intellectuals and so Judith Sklar studied with Isaiah Berlin. She was in his class in 1951 at Harvard, which is really interesting. It was a class he was teaching on the Enlightenment. But there's a kind of in Moyne's text, there's a real, I want to call it an anxiety in his text. He's anxious. Because he's committed to this narrative I described of this thing happened, we had, in Samuel Moyne's view, we had the good liberals of the 19th century, by which he means the very romantic utopian ones like John Stuart Mill. These good guys, these people, and some women too, that he admires. And he sees, he's committed to this narrative of a fall, that the ruinous 20th century comes along. Now, I have a very opposite view. I see Arendt and Berlin as heroes. I see them as having gotten things right. Certainly, they got the right, the nature and character of the Soviet Union and China right. I sort of think if you don't get that right, that's kind of a foundation of how to ethically evaluate that. But any event, this is an aesthetic way of looking at his text, but it's an anxiety. He's anxious because he's not happy with what they're doing. So, for example, he'll say, Sklar's anxiety about the coming of Cold War liberalism helps see that Berlin's maturation across the era made essential room for the disquieting possibility that the Enlightenment was itself to blame for the worst perversions of 20th century politics, especially on the left. So Berlin went so far in these gestures that he began to deploy an increasingly familiar, not to say repetitious, I thank him for not saying tedious after that. He just says repetitious strategy. Denounce the Enlightenment in public for spawning the Soviet Union, and then reassure aggrieved and worried correspondents that the Enlightenment mattered for his own liberalism too. So this is where he talks about the letters, because it's true. I've read the same letters. He says in the letters, he'll say to Irving Singer or Mary McCarthy or Jacqueline Onassis, Jacqueline Kennedy then for that matter, don't worry, I like the Enlightenment folks. I'm not totally anti-Enlightenment. They're not all bad. And I guess is Moyne saying that he didn't really mean it? Or he's saying his public face of attacking this. So it's, to his friends, he wrote that he had never dreamt of implying that it was all that bad, even though he in fact implied that very thing. As Berlin became more interested during the 1950s in the figures making up what would eventually become his counter-enlightenment, that is, the two people I mentioned in our last episode, Hamann and Herder, they were exhibit A of anti-enlightenment, counter-enlightenment. His censorious attitude toward the Enlightenment became more pronounced. So Samuel Moyne is wrestling with the fact that Berlin is wrestling. Berlin himself is wrestling, and that's actually a good thing. So it's not mere rank hypocrisy, and it's not even public face, private face. I think it's actually an aesthetic issue. By which I mean someone as learned as Berlin sees in front of him these events. This is somebody, after all, who did work for the Roosevelt. He did work in England for the World War II effort and for FDR. This is somebody who was, saw these kinds of things up close, right? I think what Berlin is doing is not hypocrisy, if I want to defend him again, but he's just simply wrestling. He's wrestling, and it's not even. I actually admire the fact that he wrestles, and he wrestles in time, rather than starting with the narrative, like Moyne does. Moyne starts with what's the arc, what's the narrative. We lost the ball, this happened, this kind of overarching narrative. Berlin is torn himself because he says, I like these aspects of the Enlightenment. I like the rationalists. But the rationalists and the Enlightenment folks did cause a lot of problems. Rousseau did cause problems. Now, of course, it's a big, complex, open question, right? How do ideas affect our futures? Ideas in their futures. What role do ideas play in possible, real, imagined, I won't say, I'm tempted to say inevitable, but not everything's inevitable, futures? Should Moyne blame all these, is it these mid-20th century folks? Are they just the bad guys? And if you really think about it, you can't, because you can't hold these folks responsible. Certainly you can't hold them responsible for what anybody does in 1998 or 2008. Not only because they're not here. I mean, that's actually rather important that they're not here. Not only because that's not their job. They're thinkers, and they're not legislators, they're not politicians, really. Of course, Berlin worked for states, but in times of war and in those contexts, that's what he was doing. He certainly was on the right side. I think anybody who works with Franklin Roosevelt and supports our side in World War II is okay. I sort of almost want to say it doesn't really matter with the later on, but that's just, that's what I think. But in any event, all these folks are wrestling with, they're tormented. So I think in a sense where some people go wrong is they're not tormented enough, or rather they don't sit with their torment or sit or wrestle. You can wrestle with things. I'm using the metaphor of wrestling. I don't wrestle, but when you wrestle with something, it's kind of like how I write a piece of music. You kind of have all these elements, and you want to get in the goo and the goop of the materials, and sit with it. And I'm interested in that. I'm interested in Lionel Trilling writing a novel as much as I'm interested in what he writes about Mansfield Park, because that's what he's doing. I'm just really could care less, frankly. Necessarily what Lionel Trilling has to say about everything. I certainly don't care that Lionel Trilling hated Ginsberg's Howl. I mean, I can imagine saying, let's say I'm somebody who's less educated, and I really like Allen Ginsberg's Howl, and I'm proud of it, and I read that Lionel Trilling wrote to Ginsberg, "Your poem sucks. Don't be a poet. I hate you." I could say, "I hate you, Lionel. How dare you? This is a great poem to me." It doesn't really matter, because Trilling isn't going to even get Howl. First of all, because Howl itself was so radical and new, I would say aesthetically when it came out. Not only that, but Trilling was into Mansfield Park and Sense and Sensibility. He's not, I'm saying on Journey of the Sleep podcast, we want a place for Howl. We want a place for Mansfield Park. We want a place for these scholars. We at the very least want to give them a listen. And if we engage with their work, we want to wrestle with them, and we want to engage with them. And for a moment, maybe, postpone judgment, if we can. Postpone judgment. And enter into what they have done and what they have accomplished, which I think is so important. And that's kind of what we're about here. I have all sorts of opinions. I have opinions about Moyne, certainly. Were Moyne here, a guest on our show, I would, if Samuel Moyne here, I would respectfully disagree with him, but you bet I would listen to that guy speak for an hour. Anything he had to say about anything, and really give it a listen. And, he would have his say. Much like the spirit of that First Amendment I just mentioned, and other things. And so I think I'm going to stop there. I thought I was going to go on longer, but again, this material is very dense, and it is very political and politicized. And we will return to next episode to the Germans, because they're so interesting, because Herder and Hamann are the same as Sklar and Trilling. I didn't say enough about Sklar. Except that she inspired me. She was a friend of George Kateb. I don't know. And she studied with Isaiah Berlin. Wrote a really interesting book called Ordinary Vices about, And she wrote a wonderful essay, her chapter of her book. What does she say here? in Ordinary Vices. I have her book here. And what does she say here? Putting cruelty first. Because Sklar thought that cruelty is the worst thing we could do. She even complains here, philosophers talk so little about cruelty. Rarely discussed, at least at that time. And that's, for her, that was a matter of some consequence and shame, perhaps. I don't know. So these were great thinkers, you know. They were. And that doesn't mean they were right about everything. It doesn't mean they voted correctly in a way we think correct. But they're worth our attention, and they're worth my attention. And that's kind of the spirit. I do hope you have a safe weekend. Hopefully not. You have some, if you're in it's winter now, it's very cold, that you can get some heat somehow, and that it's weekend goes well for you, and we will be back talking about many things as we do on our show: true crime and pianos, and there's a concert at the end of February, and all sorts of things coming up. So thank you, and to be continued.